The photograph was discovered in 1987, inside a leather portfolio wedged beneath floorboards during the demolition of a boarding house in Harlan County, Kentucky. The structure had stood abandoned for 43 years. When the contractor pulled the portfolio free, dust rose in a cloud so thick it obscured the morning light. Inside were 17 glass plate negatives, most fractured beyond recognition. But one remained intact. It showed 11 coal miners standing outside the entrance to a shaft, their faces blackened with dust, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. They wore canvas trousers and flannel shirts stiff with sweat and grime. Behind them, the mouth of the mine gaped like a wound in the earth. The image itself was unremarkable. A standard documentation photograph, the kind taken by company clerks to record crew rosters or shifts. But when the contractor showed it to a local historian, the historian's hands began to tremble. On the far right edge of the frame, extending from behind the shoulder of the nearest miner, was a hand. A left hand, pale and slender, fingers slightly curled. It did not belong to any of the 11 men visible in the photograph. The angle made it impossible for it to be the hand of someone standing behind the group. The perspective was wrong, the position anatomically unfeasible. It simply appeared, as though reaching from somewhere outside the frame of reality itself. The historian, a man named Douglas Pritchard, spent 3 weeks attempting to rationalize what he saw. He examined the negative under magnification. He consulted photographic experts from the University of Kentucky. He researched double exposure techniques common in the 1890s. None of it explained the hand. The exposure was singular. The emulsion showed no signs of manipulation, and when enhanced, the hand revealed details that made explanation even more difficult. Beneath the skin, faint but visible, were the shadows of bones, a skeletal structure that belonged to no living person in that photograph. Pritchard's investigation led him to mine records housed in the Kentucky Historical Society. He found documentation for a crew photograph taken at the Black Laurel Mine on November 14, 1892. 11 miners were listed by name, but the record also contained a handwritten note in the margin, added by the company's clerk: plate damaged, reprint requested, foreman refused. No explanation was given for the refusal, no further prints were ever made, and within 6 months of the photograph being taken, the Black Laurel Mine was abandoned, not because of a collapse, not because the coal ran dry, but because the men refused to go back inside. What Pritchard uncovered in the months that followed would reveal not a ghost story, but something far more disturbing. A record of silence, a conspiracy of fear, and a truth buried so deeply that even those who knew it could not speak its name aloud. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because we unearth the buried truths that history tried to erase, one photograph, one document, one impossible detail at a time. The Appalachian coal fields in 1892 were not merely sources of fuel, they were instruments of a particular kind of American brutality. In eastern Kentucky, where the Black Laurel Mine operated, coal companies wielded power that eclipsed law, religion, and kinship. Miners lived in company housing, bought food from company stores, and when they died, which they did frequently, were buried in company graves. The system was designed to extract not just coal, but life itself, in increments so small that resistance seemed impossible. The men who worked these shafts were predominantly Scots-Irish, descendants of settlers who had moved into the hollows and ridges generations earlier. They spoke in Elizabethan-inflected dialects, sang ballads carried from Ulster, and practiced a Christianity so austere it bordered on fatalism. They believed in signs, birds that foretold death, dreams that revealed hidden water, and omens written in the behavior of animals and weather. This was not superstition, it was survival. In a world where a single timber failure could crush a man to pulp, where gas could turn a lantern into an inferno, belief in the unseen was a form of vigilance. The Black Laurel Mine was opened in 1889 by the Southeastern Coal and Lumber Syndicate, a conglomerate based in Philadelphia. The seam it tapped ran nearly 7 feet high in places, a geologic fortune. But the mine was plagued from the beginning. 3 men died in the first year, not from explosions or collapses, but from what the company physician listed as respiratory failure of unknown origin. The bodies, when examined, showed no external injury, but their lungs, according to a surviving coroner's report, appeared withered, as though drained. By 1892, the Black Laurel employed 47 men across 2 shifts. Discipline was maintained by a foreman named Caleb Oakes, a man described in personal letters as silent as stone and possessed of a gaze that could stop a mule. Oakes had worked in the mines since childhood. His father had died in a cave-in in West Virginia. His brother had been blinded by a methane flash in Pennsylvania. Caleb himself bore scars across his back from a roof fall that should have killed him, but left him inexplicably standing. It was Oakes who ordered the photograph taken on November 14, 1892. Company policy required annual documentation of each crew, but this request came outside the usual schedule. Oakes gave no reason. He assembled 11 men from the morning shift and led them to the mine entrance just after dawn. A traveling photographer, hired by the company for documentation work, set up his camera on a tripod and exposed a single plate. The men returned to work. The photographer packed his equipment and left Harlan County the same afternoon. 3 days later, when the developed negative arrived at the company office, the clerk who opened the envelope reportedly stared at it for several minutes before sealing it again and bringing it directly to Oakes. What happened in that conversation was never recorded. But the clerk, a man named Matthias Stern, wrote a letter to his sister in Ohio the following week. The letter survived in a family archive and was obtained by Pritchard in 1988. In it, Stern wrote, "I have seen something that makes me question whether the earth is entirely the domain of the living. I showed the foreman the photograph. He looked at it without expression, then told me to burn it. I asked why. He said, 'Because some things must stay buried.' I did not burn it. I do not know why, but I wish I had." The photograph was placed in the company safe. No reprint was ever ordered, and within 2 weeks, the first man vanished. His name was Owen Harold. He was 23 years old, married, father to a daughter not yet 2. He worked the deep shaft, the section of the mine that descended nearly 400 feet below the surface, where the air grew thin and the darkness felt, according to those who worked there, alive. Owen disappeared on November 27, 1892. He entered the mine at dawn with the morning crew. When the shift ended at dusk, he did not emerge. His crew reported that he had been working in Shaft 7, the farthest extension of the tunnel system, installing support timbers. They said he had been alone for the final 2 hours of the shift, a violation of company policy, but common practice when manpower was stretched thin. A search was conducted immediately. Caleb Oakes himself led a team of 6 men back into the mine, carrying lanterns and rope. They found Owen's tools exactly where he had been working. His hammer lay on the ground. His saw rested against a timber. His lunch pail sat unopened beside a water jug. But Owen was gone. The tunnel ended in a rock face, solid stone, untouched by pick or drill. There were no secondary passages, no hidden fissures large enough for a man to enter. The only way out was the way in. Yet Owen Harold had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Oakes ordered the shaft sealed. He told the crew that Owen must have wandered into a side passage in confusion, perhaps overcome by gas, and that recovery would be attempted once proper equipment arrived. But no equipment ever came, and no recovery was ever attempted. The company issued a death certificate citing accidental suffocation. Owen's widow received $20 and an eviction notice. She left Harlan County with her daughter and was never heard from again. But Owen Harold's disappearance was not the end. It was the invitation. On December 9th, a miner named Samuel Kinney reported hearing his name called while working alone in Shaft 3. He said the voice came from behind him, but when he turned, no one was there. He described the voice as wet, like something speaking through water. He refused to return to that section of the mine. On December 14th, 2 men working side by side in Shaft 5, both stopped simultaneously and looked toward the tunnel wall. When asked later what they had seen, they gave identical answers. A door. They described it as a rectangular seam in the stone, faintly luminous, present for only a moment before the rock returned to its original state. Neither man would go back underground. On December 19th, a miner named Thomas Eccles emerged from the shaft in the middle of his shift, climbed into a company wagon, and rode 15 miles to the county seat. He walked into the sheriff's office and said, "There is something in the mine that is not coal, and it is waking up." When pressed for details, he refused to speak further. He left Kentucky the next morning and died 3 years later in a railway accident in Ohio. By the end of December, 11 men had either quit, disappeared, or refused to enter the Black Laurel mine. Caleb Oakes replaced them with workers brought in from Virginia and Tennessee, men unfamiliar with the site, men who had not yet heard the stories. But the stories spread faster than silence could contain them. It was during this time that Matthias Stern, the company clerk, began keeping a private journal. Excerpts from this journal were found among his effects after his death in 1931. In an entry dated January 3, 1893, he wrote, "The men speak of it in whispers. They say the mine has always been wrong, that the coal seam was opened into something that should have remained sealed. Oakes refuses to address it, but I have noticed he no longer goes below the second level, and I have noticed that he keeps the photograph locked in his desk now, rather than the safe. I asked him why. He said, 'So I can burn it quickly if I need to.'" What none of them yet understood was that the photograph was not evidence of something that had happened. It was evidence of something that was still happening. The hand in the image was not a mistake, not an artifact of the emulsion or the light. It was a marker, a boundary, a sign that the membrane between what was buried and what was alive had grown dangerously thin. And in the third week of January, that membrane tore open. The collapse occurred on January 24, 1893, at approximately 2:17 in the afternoon. It was not a structural failure. The timbering in Shaft 6, where the collapse originated, had been inspected that same morning and deemed sound. Yet the tunnel imploded inward, not from the weight of the earth above, but from something pulling it downward. 4 men were in the shaft when it happened. 3 managed to escape. The 4th, a man named Peter Lowell, was caught at the waist by falling stone. The survivors described what they saw in terms so consistent that their testimonies, recorded separately, are nearly identical. They said the air in the tunnel turned cold. Not the damp chill of underground work, but a cold so severe that their breath crystallized and their hands went numb. They said the darkness beyond their lantern light became thicker, textured, almost granular, as though the absence of light had taken on substance. And they said they heard breathing. Not the labored breath of injured men, not the hiss of escaping gas, but slow, deliberate inhalations coming from the walls themselves. One man, a logger named Isaiah Trent, described it as the sound of the earth remembering how to wake. Peter Lowell, pinned and unable to move, began screaming. But his screams were not of pain. They were pleas. He begged the other men to leave him. He said, "It wants to pull me through. Don't let it pull me through." He clawed at the stone trapping him, not to free himself but to hold himself in place. The men tried to lift the rock. It would not move. They tried to dig him free. The stone beneath him had fused into a surface as smooth as glass. And then, as they worked, they saw something that made them stop. Peter's body was sinking, not collapsing under pressure, not being crushed, but sinking, slowly, steadily, as though the rock had turned to liquid. His legs disappeared first, then his hips, his torso. He did not scream anymore. He only stared at them, his face pale, his lips moving in what looked like a prayer or a plea. And then the stone closed over him, and he was gone. The 3 men ran. They emerged from the mine and collapsed outside the entrance, gulping air, their hands shaking so violently they could not hold their tools. Caleb Oakes was summoned. He went into the mine alone, carrying a single lantern. He was underground for 40 minutes. When he emerged, his face was gray, his shirt drenched in sweat despite the January cold. He said nothing to the gathered crowd. He walked directly to the company office, retrieved the photograph from his desk, and burned it in the coal stove. Then he sent a telegram to the Southeastern Coal and Lumber Syndicate in Philadelphia. The message, preserved in company archives, read, "Mine no longer operable. Immediate closure required. Will provide full report upon request. Do not send replacement crew." The syndicate responded within 2 days, not with questions, but with instructions. Seal the mine, dismiss the workers, and transfer all records to the central office. No investigation was conducted. No report was filed. And on February 2, 1893, the Black Laurel mine was officially closed. The entrance was dynamited, the shaft filled with rubble, and the site abandoned. But the story did not end there, because Peter Lowell's body was never recovered, and 3 weeks after the mine was sealed, his widow received a letter. It was postmarked from Harlan County, dated February 18, 1893. The handwriting was Peter's. The letter contained only one sentence: "I am still beneath, but I am no longer alone." If you feel the weight of what you just heard, leave a comment with the words, "Some doors should never be opened." Let me know you're here. Let me know you understand. The letter sent to Peter Lowell's widow was not the only one. Over the following months, 3 more letters arrived, each addressed to families of men who had disappeared or died in the Black Laurel mine. All bore postmarks from Harlan County. All were written in the handwriting of the deceased, and all contained messages that suggested consciousness, location, and an awareness of time passing. Owen Harold's widow, who had left Kentucky and remarried in Tennessee, received a letter in March of 1893. It read, "I have been walking in the seam. There are others here. They have been walking much longer." The family of Thomas Eccles, the man who had fled to Ohio and died in a railway accident, received a letter in April. It was dated 2 weeks after his death. It read, "The door I saw was real. I went through it without knowing. Now I cannot find my way back." Matthias Stern, the company clerk, received a letter addressed to himself in May. It was written in his own handwriting. It read, "You kept the photograph. That was a mistake. Now it keeps you." Stern, terrified, brought the letters to the county sheriff. The sheriff dismissed them as cruel hoaxes, the work of someone exploiting tragedy for amusement. But Stern could not let it go. He began his own investigation, traveling throughout eastern Kentucky, interviewing miners who had worked at Black Laurel and neighboring sites. What he discovered was a pattern that had been unfolding for decades. The coal seams of the Appalachian Plateau, Stern learned, were not uniform. Geological surveys conducted in the 1880s had noted anomalous formations in several regions, sections of the seam where the coal was unusually pure, almost crystalline, and where the surrounding stone exhibited properties that defied standard classification. Miners referred to these zones as cold seams because the temperature within them dropped noticeably, even at significant depth. Stories about these seams existed in oral tradition long before industrial mining began. The Cherokee, who had inhabited the region for centuries before European settlement, avoided certain areas entirely. They spoke of places where the earth breathed backward, where time moved differently, and where those who entered did not return, or returned changed. Stern documented 12 separate incidents across Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia between 1870 and 1893, in which miners reported encounters similar to those at Black Laurel, voices in the tunnels, figures glimpsed in the darkness, disappearances that could not be explained by cave-ins or gas. In every case, the mine in question was eventually abandoned, not due to economic failure, but because the workers refused to continue. But Stern's most disturbing discovery came from a geological report filed in 1885 by a surveyor named Dr. Amos Blackwell. Blackwell had been hired by a Pittsburgh-based mining company to assess potential sites in Harlan County. His report, buried in state archives, contained a passage that Stern copied into his journal. In section 14, at a depth of approximately 340 feet, we encountered a formation that does not correspond to known sedimentary patterns. The coal in this seam is not compressed organic matter, but something denser, older, and crystallographically distinct. When struck with a hammer, it produces a tone, a resonance that persists for several seconds. The sound is not mechanical. It resembles disturbingly a human voice attempting to form words. I recommend this section be excluded from commercial extraction. The recommendation was ignored. The section Blackwell described was the exact location where the Black Laurel mine's deepest shafts were later driven. Stern attempted to present his findings to the Southeastern Coal and Lumber Syndicate. He was told his services were no longer required and was dismissed from employment in June of 1893. He left Kentucky and moved to Ohio, where he worked as a schoolteacher until his death in 1931. But he never stopped searching for an explanation. In his final journal entry, written 3 days before he died, Stern wrote, "I have come to believe that what we call coal is, in certain places, not coal at all. It is the residue of something that existed before geology, before time as we understand it. We have been mining into a graveyard, and in doing so, we have disturbed something that was buried not by nature, but by intention." Meanwhile, in Harlan County, the sealed entrance to the Black Laurel mine became a site of local folklore. Children were warned not to go near it. Hunters avoided the area. And on certain nights, residents of the nearby town of Evarts reported hearing sounds emanating from the hillside where the mine had been. Rhythmic thumping, like hammers on stone, and beneath it, a low, sustained hum that made the windows rattle. In 1902, a group of boys exploring the woods near the mine entrance found something partially buried in the soil. A human hand, skeletal, but with fragments of desiccated tissue still clinging to the bone. It was brought to the town physician, who noted in his report that the hand showed no signs of decay consistent with 9 years of burial. The tissue, he wrote, appeared preserved, as though submerged in brine or sealed in ice. The hand was never identified. It was buried in the town cemetery under a marker that read only, "Unknown, 1893. And in Philadelphia, in the archives of the Southeastern Coal and Lumber Syndicate, a single photograph remained. Not the original, that had been burned by Caleb Oakes, but a copy, made before the destruction, retained by the company for reasons never explained. It showed 11 miners, and on the far right edge, extending from behind the nearest man's shoulder, a hand that belonged to no one. When the syndicate dissolved in 1920, the photograph was transferred to a private collection. It changed hands 3 times over the following decades, and in 1987, when it was finally discovered in that boarding house in Harlan County, it had returned to the place where it was taken, as though it had been waiting. Douglas Pritchard's investigation, which began as historical curiosity, became an obsession. After uncovering Matthias Stern's journal and Dr. Blackwell's geological report, Pritchard requested access to the sealed mine site. The land, by 1987, was privately owned by a descendant of the original coal syndicate. Permission was denied, but Pritchard was not deterred. In the summer of 1988, he hired a local guide, a man in his 70s named Virgil Cottle, whose grandfather had worked at Black Laurel, and together they hiked to the location where the mine entrance had been dynamited and sealed 95 years earlier. What they found troubled them both. The hillside above the sealed shaft had subsided, not collapsed, but sunken, as though the earth beneath had been hollowed out. Trees in the immediate area were dead, their bark blackened, their branches bare despite the season. The soil was cold to the touch, even in direct sunlight, and gave off a faint odor that Cottle described as like rust and something rotting, but not organic. Pritchard took soil samples, temperature readings, and photographs. He also used a handheld seismograph to measure ground vibration. The readings showed a low-frequency oscillation, rhythmic and continuous, emanating from deep below the surface. The frequency was consistent with industrial machinery, except no machinery had operated at the site in nearly a century. Cottle, who had been reluctant to approach the site at all, refused to go further. He told Pritchard, "My grandfather said this place was cursed, not by God, not by the devil, by something older. He said the mountain didn't want to be opened, and when it was, it let something out that had been locked away since before men had names for things." Pritchard returned to the site alone 3 more times over the following months. On his final visit, in October of 1988, He brought a portable drill and attempted to extract a core sample from the subsided area. The drill penetrated 18 inches before striking resistance. Not rock, something harder. When Pritchard examined the drill bit, he found it had been blunted, the carbide tip worn smooth, as though it had been grinding against glass or metal. He abandoned the drill and instead used a small excavation tool to clear soil from the surface. 6 inches down, he uncovered something that made him stop. It was a fragment of timber, old, blackened, but unmistakably cut and shaped. It was part of a support beam, the kind used in mine shafts. But according to all records, the mine entrance had been buried under tons of rubble. This timber should not have been accessible from the surface. Pritchard carefully removed more soil. The timber extended downward, disappearing into the earth at an angle that suggested it was still attached to a larger structure. And then he saw something else. Carved into the surface of the wood, in letters crude but deliberate, was a single word: below. Pritchard photographed the timber, reburied it, and left the site. He did not return. In his personal notes he wrote, "I do not know what is beneath that hillside, but I know it is not simply coal, and it is not simply death. It is something that remains conscious, and it is waiting." He submitted his findings to the Kentucky Geological Survey. They declined to investigate, citing budgetary constraints and lack of evidence of active hazard. Pritchard then contacted the U.S. Geological Survey. They responded with a polite letter stating that anomalous readings in abandoned mine sites are common and typically attributable to natural gas migration or groundwater movement. Frustrated, Pritchard published his research independently in a small historical journal in 1989. The article, titled "The Black Laurel Anomaly, Industrial Tragedy or Geologic Mystery," was read by fewer than 200 people. But one of those readers was a geologist named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who specialized in deep earth formations and had spent years studying subterranean acoustic phenomena. Vasquez contacted Pritchard and requested access to his data. After reviewing his seismograph readings, soil samples, and photographs, she arrived at a conclusion that Pritchard had suspected but could not prove. The oscillations he had recorded were not random. They followed a pattern. A repeating sequence of low-frequency pulses, spaced at intervals that suggested intentionality. Vasquez wrote in her analysis, "What Mr. Pritchard has documented is not the byproduct of geological settling or gas movement. It is a signal. Whether biological, mechanical, or something outside those categories, I cannot say. But it is structured, and it is continuous." She recommended further investigation. She offered to assemble a team, secure funding, and conduct a formal excavation. But before any of that could happen, the land was sold. In 1991, the property containing the former Black Laurel mine site was purchased by a private development company based in Lexington. Their plans, according to public records, involved clearing the area for potential residential construction. Pritchard and Vasquez both submitted letters of protest, requesting a heritage preservation review. Their requests were denied. In the spring of 1992, construction crews arrived. They began clearing vegetation and grading the subsided area. On the third day of work, one of the excavators reported that his machine had hit something solid, approximately 12 feet below the surface. He described it as like digging into concrete, but the blade bounced off. The site foreman ordered the crew to dig by hand. They cleared soil down to a depth of 15 feet and exposed a surface of stone, smooth, black, and cold. It was not coal. It was not limestone. It was not any material the workers recognized. And carved across the surface in letters 3 feet tall was a message: "Do not open what was closed." The construction company halted work immediately. The site was abandoned. And within 6 months, the development company declared bankruptcy and dissolved. The land remains vacant. The subsided area remains untouched. And beneath the soil, the signal continues. In 1998, Douglas Pritchard received a package in the mail. It had no return address. Inside was a photograph, a modern print but showing an image that was over a century old. It was the photograph from the Black Laurel mine. the same image Pritchard had seen in the leather portfolio 11 years earlier. But this version was different. The hand on the right side of the frame, the hand that belonged to no one, was no longer reaching from behind the miner's shoulder. It was now resting on the miner's shoulder, fingers spread, as though in a gesture of greeting or possession. Pritchard examined the print under magnification. The emulsion, the grain, the exposure, all were consistent with the original 1892 glass plate. There was no evidence of digital manipulation, no sign of modern reproduction techniques. It was as though the photograph itself had changed. He contacted Dr. Vasquez. She flew to Kentucky and examined the print personally. Her conclusion was the same. The image could not have been altered by any known method. Either it was an elaborate and technically flawless forgery, or the photograph had somehow transformed. Pritchard attempted to locate the original glass plate negative, hoping to compare it directly. But the plate, which had been stored in the Kentucky Historical Society's archive, could not be found. The records indicated it had been logged into the collection in 1987 and placed in climate-controlled storage. But when archivists searched for it, the shelf was empty. No checkout record existed. No transfer had been documented. The plate had simply vanished. In 2003, Pritchard published a second article, this time in a journal focused on archival anomalies and historical mysteries. The article included reproductions of both versions of the photograph, the original, showing the hand behind the shoulder, and the newer version, showing the hand resting upon it. He posed a single question. Is it possible for a photograph to document not only what was, but what is becoming? The article generated significant attention, but no answers. Skeptics dismissed it as hoax or delusion. Believers saw it as evidence of something paranormal. But Pritchard, in private correspondence with Vasquez, expressed a different theory. I believe the photograph is not changing. I believe it is revealing. The hand was always there, always moving, always reaching. The image we see is not static. It is a window, and whatever is on the other side is becoming aware that we are watching. In 2007, Pritchard died of a heart attack at the age of 64. Among his personal effects was a final, unpublished manuscript. It was titled The Appalachian Signal, a study of consciousness beneath the earth. In it, he detailed every piece of evidence he had gathered over 2 decades. The letters from the dead, the geological anomalies, the rhythmic oscillations, the changing photograph. His conclusion was stark. We have always assumed that what lies beneath the earth is inert, coal, stone, fossil, mineral, dead matter, waiting to be extracted. But what if certain formations are not dead? What if they are dormant? And what if, in our eagerness to dig, we have awakened something that was meant to remain asleep? The manuscript was never published. Dr. Vasquez, who inherited Pritchard's research, attempted to bring it to academic attention, but was met with indifference or ridicule. She eventually donated the entire archive to a private research foundation specializing in geological mysteries. But the story does not end with Pritchard's death. In 2011, a hiker exploring the woods near the former Black Laurel mine site reported finding a man standing at the edge of the subsided area. The man was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, canvas trousers, a flannel shirt, boots caked in mud. The hiker called out to him. The man turned. His face, the hiker later told police, was gray, like stone, but his eyes were open, and he was looking at me. The hiker ran. When he returned with a sheriff's deputy 2 hours later, no one was there. But in the soil where the man had been standing, they found footprints, deep, as though made by someone carrying great weight. The prints led toward the subsided area, and then stopped abruptly, as though the person had simply sunk into the ground. In 2014, a team of urban explorers attempted to access the sealed mine using ground-penetrating radar. The scan revealed a network of voids and tunnels far more extensive than the original mine map suggested. Passages that extended horizontally for miles and descended to depths that exceeded modern mining capability. At the deepest point detected by the radar, nearly 800 feet below the surface, the scan identified a hollow space roughly the size of a cathedral, and within that space, something moved. The data was inconclusive. The team's equipment malfunctioned before a second scan could be completed, but the lead researcher, in an interview afterward, said, "We saw movement, not collapse, not gas, not water. Movement. Something down there shifted position while we were scanning. I don't know what it was, but it was large, and it was deliberate. No further expeditions have been authorized. The photograph, the one showing the hand resting on the miner's shoulder, resides now in a private collection in Boston. The owner, who requested anonymity, reported in 2019 that the hand has moved again. It is no longer resting on the shoulder. It is now raised, palm open, as though waving or beckoning. And in Harlan County, on certain nights when the wind is still and the moon is dark, residents near the site of the Black Laurel mine report hearing sounds rising from the earth. The rhythmic thump of hammers on stone, the creak of timber under pressure, and beneath it all, a low, resonant hum that makes the ground vibrate and the air taste like iron. Some say it is only the mountain settling. Others say it is the memory of men who died in the dark. But a few, those who have lived in these hills long enough to know the difference between wind and breath, say it is neither. They say it is the sound of something waking up. And they say it has been waking for a very long time. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about what lies beneath the places we've forgotten, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit the like button. Because some truths, once unearthed, refuse to stay buried.